What's up, everybody? I've had a lot of requests for my Stunling build guide, and so today I'm going to talk through the different variations from like step 1, 2, and 3 of the Stunling build, and talk through what your priorities are for gear, as well as how to itemize and build the character up from switching into the variant and into the end game to more or less where I am now. So I wouldn't say that I'm like super min-maxed, but I am at a point that I am very happy with, able to just hold Tempest Flurry and clear T4 simulacrums, clear most content. And for bossing, it is super safe because you do stun everything. And so that's the whole point of the name Stunling. So it's the stun variant of Gemling. And how do we accomplish this? We accomplish this by using Overwhelming Presence, and you may have seen this used in other builds as well. We are using it in this build too, with similar tech as what other builds are running. So Overwhelming Presence reduces the ailment threshold as well as the stun threshold of enemies in your presence. And this counts as an aura and can be boosted using aura increased effective auras from aura skills. So this is the core concept, and this core has been used in other builds as well, and I decided to make a Gemling variant because I wasn't happy with how it was being used in those other techniques. Like I saw it on Auto Bomber and it really just did not feel great. So here we are with a Gemling focused around this aura. And step 1 is to just get your Overwhelming Presence and just get your basic jewels with 10% increased effective auras. And you do need to keep in mind that you have to hit up to a certain threshold, but not over, because then it just bricks the skill. So what you need to do is take out your calculator, because at skill level 21, you have 30% increased effect. You have 30% reduced threshold, and you want to hit 99%. So take out your calculator, and you need 3.3 as a multiplier, which means that you need 230% increased effective auras. Now, when you're on a budget, so this is step 1, you are not going to hit this very easily. This is not something that you hit immediately, but the more you scale, and this is going to be your main scaling into the late game, is that you keep scaling the aura of Overwhelming Presence. So normally what you would be looking at for the early game, for the more budget versions of this build, is you're going to be looking for just rare jewels, 10% increased effective auras, and then maybe crit chance or crit damage on top. And these are going to be much cheaper. You're talking 20 to 50 exalts a piece for rares like this. So this is something that even if you're on a budget Gemling, you can start working towards and start building up as you are working, as you are building up your Gemling. And then you keep increasing the effect of the aura on Overwhelming Presence. So where I'm at right now, I have roughly 96-97% reduced ailment threshold on enemies. And so this lends itself very well to the Gemling in particular, because Gemlings use Tempest Bell, and Tempest Bell also scales off of how many ailments that you apply to it. So shock, freeze, and ignite. We take that concept, and so Gemlings normally on one of the rings are going to be running fire damage, or fire and cold between the two rings. And that's how you get your ailments on the bell. So we take that a step further, and now we can, with the combination of Overwhelming Presence and having those ailments on the rings, and the fact that you have Hoa, so you're always dealing lightning anyway, you are now applying to every enemy, you are applying shock, freeze, ignite, and stun. And so you are dealing a ton of crowd control, because you can, even on extremely tanky bosses, you can more or less just rotate stun, freeze, and the entire time you're shocking. And then this is proccing and buffing up Elemental Invocation. So while on other builds you're seeing cast on shock for things, you're seeing cast on shock, cast on freeze, cast on ignite. Because we are consistently able to deal all the ailments to enemies, we are going to be running elemental invocation. And the difference between elemental invocation, one of the cast-ons, or there's multiple, but the first thing is elemental invocation does not take mana to cast, but you have to manually cast it. The other thing is energy is gained off of all three of the ailments, while the cast-ons are single ailment focused. So using elemental invocation, we are going to be gaining much more energy than we would be with any of the cast-ons, and this lets you proc whatever skill you put in much more than with one of the cast-ons. And you may have noticed that I scrolled past cast on shock, but this is only being used for Frostwall and Eye of Winter. And because we don't actually want to proc these too much, Frostwall has a limit anyway because of the cooldown, and then Eye of Winter you just need to proc a few times, get the critical weakness on, so we don't, and you don't want to spam it too much in the end anyway. So that's the main thing. So we take that premise of boosting auras and applying a bunch of ailments to enemies, and that's how we build in from overwhelming presence and elemental invocation. Now the other thing is we're already pushing the envelope for auras. So why not take advantage of having all that aura buffing and buff a second aura? And that's where Blasphemy comes in. And this is why we need so much spirit in the build. Blasphemy lets you apply a curse as an aura around you. And we choose conductivity because our main damage is lightning. Now you could also choose temporal chains. If you play in parties with other people, you could use other curses as well in this slot. That's going to be up to you. But for solo focus, I use conductivity, and often a lot of my friends are also either playing a similar Gemling build or they're playing Spark. Conductivity works really well in this case. But it's just letting you know that you can choose to use other curses here. So we get to boost our conductivity curse aura with those same gems that we're using to boost overwhelming presence. And this lets us push conductivity to roughly minus 80% lightning resistance on enemies. And why does that matter? Because the formula for res is that you do res removal first, like conductivity, then you do exposure, and then you do penetration. The thing about res removal and penetration is they do not go below 0, but exposure can go below 0. So if in the beginning of that chain you remove all the res from the enemy, which we are doing with conductivity, generally enemies are not pushing past 80% lightning res unless you have a crazy juiced map with a very specific atlas. Generally that minus 80% even on pinnacle bosses is enough to remove all the resistances. And then your lightning exposure is now becoming a multiplier instead of just removing some more res. So in a more normal build, like some other content creators, unnamed, you're going to be applying exposure to remove 20% of their res first, and then using pen to get through the rest. But now, because we're removing all the all the resistance from the beginning, now lightning exposure becomes a multiplier for us because it drops below 0. So now we have a 20% multiplier on top, or a 1.2 multiplier on top because of exposure. And then this can also be boosted by other exposure boosting effects as well. So this is how we're taking advantage of the fact that we're building aura in the build. And so we have a build that is extremely capable for both single player, because being able to, and single player and party, because being able to constantly have everything in your presence CC'd, crowd controlled, stun, shocked, ignite. This helps with other players as well. So let's say you're playing Simulacrum. You are an amazing support. Even if you just sit there in the middle, you are an amazing support to, say, a Spark player, because you are removing all the resistances from the enemy, and the Sparks will stun as well. It doesn't have to be you that hits them. The Spark user can stun as well. So that's the core concept of the build, and that's why we build so much spirit, is so that we can run at the minimum Blasphemy, Overwhelming Presence, Elemental Invocation, and the Cast on Shock also helps as well for bossing. And then you swap into, for mapping, your double heralds. This is very standard to run double heralds with these Gemling builds. We're not doing anything special here. So let's talk about the actual skills and what is the priority to budget. First, Tempest Flurry and Tempest Bell are the most important to 5-socket. Afterwards, I would say Cast on Shock would be quite important. So Tempest Flurry is a given. You have your martial tempo for movement, overcharge from Magnitude of Shock, because Magnitude of Shock is a multiplier, and you don't have to worry about shock duration. You're always going to have shock applied with how fast you're hitting and how little the ailment threshold is on enemies. Rage on hit, and this gets swapped out with Inspiration. So you swap out Inspiration for being able to move more, map. So if you're mapping or just, let's say, doing Sanctum, Trial of Chaos, anything like that, you don't need the damage from Rage. You pop Inspiration in. For bossing, I switch to Rage. Generally, you kill bosses so fast, you don't even get to build up Rage anyway, but just saying that if you are on a budget, you will notice the effect of Rage and will want to switch into it. So I always keep it on my Quarterstaff Strike right above, and I can swap in. Similarly, for mapping, Ice Bite is popular too. And so you swap Ice Bite into your Tempest Flurry with Inspiration, and that's your mapping setup. And for bossing, you swap in Crescendo and Rage, like this. So Tempest Flurry is very important to get to 5-socket. And similarly for Tempest Bell, we have our concentrated effect, just more area damage in the area. Lightning Effusion, since we primarily deal lightning damage, it is very important for us to boost our lightning. We have our Rising Tempest, more elemental damage for each skill used recently of a different elemental type. Overabundance, +1 to limit. Skill effect duration does not matter as much because we are going to be breaking the bell anyway with how it works. So bell is destroyed after 25 hits. That's going to be no problem. We're going to be destroying the bell faster than the skill effect will expire. Faster than the bell will expire. And Primal Armament, we are dealing with lightning, weapon damage, and the 2 flats anyway from your rings generally. So no worries. We run Primal Armament, very important. Afterwards, I just want to take a quick note for Stormwave. This is completely optional. The only time I use this is to snipe enemies far away. So for example, if there's a chasm, I can snipe them on the other side. I use this a lot in Trial of Sekimus, where it's a ritual trial. I can snipe from the left to right without ever leaving the center line of the map. I just can snipe the rituals from further away and save myself time when I'm clearing. But otherwise, Stormwave is completely optional. You do not need to run this. You can completely drop it from your build, not build it at all. 2, 3 socket, 4 socket, whatever, it's not a big deal. So we talked about Blasphemy, Overwhelming, Heralds. For Heralds, keeping them at 4 socket is very cheap, very effective. You do not need Calling Strike. And then you can drop the Cold Penetration or the Ambush. Either one's fine if you want to keep it at 4 socket and save yourself the money for the for that Perfect Jewelers. So really, I would say the only 2 that particularly need it are the Tempest Flurry and Tempest Bell. Elemental Invocation, we're running Ember Fusillade and swapping to Ball Lightning for bossing, and I'll get into that in a second. Impetus, more energy gain, energy retention, chance to refund energy when used. And then if you want to be on a budget, Scatter Shot with Ball Lightning, and Arcane Tempo with Ember Fusillade. And now, why Ember Fusillade? This is the lowest cast time skill in the game, which means cast time is what determines the energy cost of the skill. So because it's so low, as soon as I hit one enemy with Tempest Flurry, because of the shock, the ignites, because of the shock, ignite, everything else, I gain so much energy that I can use Elemental Invocation multiple times with Ember Fusillade, because the cast time is so low, and it's also aided by Arcane Tempo. And why is this important? This is how we regain most of our mana. Invocated efficiency. Through bossing using Ball Lightning, and through mapping with Ember Fusillade, your damage, and because you're doing so much crowd control and everything else, you will not really ever need to Mana Flask. So between Ember Fusillade Ember Fusillade on Elemental Invocation and Invocated Efficiency, as you're mapping, you're just holding Tempest Flurry, running around, smashing everything, and you are generating a ton of mana. Do remember, you do have to manually cast Elemental Invocation. Personally, I have an auto hotkey so that both of them are linked together. So I hold right click, and it also holds Elemental Invocation at the same time. That auto hotkey script is pinned on my Discord, so you will be able to reference that and download it and use it. And I have the instructions there. So back to the skill gems. Again, I would swap to Ball Lightning, and if you are more on a budget, then you could keep Scatter Shot, and then with Ember Fusillade, you can keep the Arcane Tempo. Orb of Storms. This is honestly not super relevant. I do leave Font of Rage on it, so what you can do is, while waiting for bosses to spawn, because all of them except King of the Mist seem to have extremely long spawn times, you can just drop it down and generate some rage for yourself before the boss spawns. So if you're walking up to Xyrok, walking to Xyrok's arena, you just put some down as a path for yourself. But again, this is extremely minimal. Orb of Storms does do minor amounts for you anyway. So use it if you want. It's there. It's not that hard to run, even if you're just using it for rage. Now, yes, Frost Wall is in the build, and so that means Trample Toe is in the build. This is an obvious one. There's not too much that we need from the boot slot anyway, so even if you were running a standard Gemling, at most you would be running, say, Expert Feathered Sandals for high energy shield, as well as maybe some int on top. That would be effectively it. Or you run Hybrid and have a Dex int shoe with rarity. That would effectively be what you would see with other builds. We may as well use Trample Toe slot for this. We may as well use Trample Toe. And so, we need a lot of spirit. We need exactly 226 spirit. You can actually make do with 225 or even less, and I'll talk about that in a second. But 226 is the normal setup that you will need. Blasphemy, make sure that you do have full quality on Blasphemy and cast on Shock and Elemental Invocation. But cast on Shock, Blasphemy, effective quality, reduced reservation cost. So normally it's 60 spirit per socketed curse, and it goes down to 54. If you corrupt it to 22% or higher, it takes one less reservation. So you could make do with the full build on 225 spirit. So it's a tiny bit cheaper on the Alpha Howl. I run a 26 spirit Alpha Howl with 74% cold resistance. If you get this kind of setup with 70+% cold resistance, along with your Grand Regalia, you will cap cold res just off of those two pieces. You know, and it's probably pretty obvious why cold resistance is, or why resistance is, and you want to get them where you can, because everything is unique in the build, except the rings, which resist slots share with suffix slots. Share suffix slots with attributes. So you're running triple attributes on both your rings. You have no space here for any resists besides the Regalia. So where do you actually get your resists? You get them from jewels. That's not a good example because that's corrupted blood. This is lightning res. That's int. So lightning res, fire res. This is where I'm getting all of my resistances. Chaos res. So that's where I'm getting all my resistances. And it's also important then to have a much better controlled metamorphosis for this build to reduce the impact of the controlled metamorphosis on your resist, because it is a very tight build. If you are fully optimal, 10% resist on every jewel slot, you will have no problem capping all your resistances and even having leftover spots to have int rolls on top, which are the ideal for damage. But otherwise, that is how you get your resistances in a build like this. That is where the expensive min-max tier goes to. But I will talk about starting from budget into min-maxing. So that's where the Alpha Howl comes in for that spirit. 226 is the most you'll need, and that's for both swaps, by the way. They both take 226 because of Blasphemy, and everything else matches up. So your cast on shock gets changed for the double heralds, and that's 60 for each. You can remove heightened curse and save yourself another 22 spirit. So again, you can quality Blasphemy to 22% or better and get an extra spirit back, so you'll need 225, and then you can also save another 22 spirit by taking out heightened curse, and that drops it down to a requirement of 103 that you need on top. And a 103 Alpha Howl is very cheap. You can get that for very cheap, so around 3 to 5 divs would be a minimum Alpha Howl that I would recommend. Or again, when you're on a budget, you can get a standard Alpha Howl, a 100 spirit, and then you use the amulet slot to get the rest of the spirit that you need. So let's talk about where you're going to start with this build. If you're running into this build, chances are you've either seen me streaming or you're playing Gemling and you want more direction in where to take your build at the end. And you've probably seen unnamed other streamer or content creator. There's a few Gemling builds out there, and then mine. So you have a standard framework of you're always going to get the Hoa, you're always going to get an Ingenuity, a Regalia, a Pillar of the Caged God. These are the very standard things that are going to be there for every single Gemling, and if you've started a Gemling, you've already thought about this or already have it or whatever. Then it's where you take it after. So you have the basic framework of the items. Where do you take it after? My build is one of the variants that you're going to build into at the end. Obviously, I'm biased. I think mine is the best. Everyone's going to say that their own is the best. I would imagine anyway. And for budget purposes, what you're going to want to do is instead of the Astromantis, you're going to get yourself an amulet with spirit with all attributes, and then you use this slot to res fix. You use this slot to fix your resistances that you're not getting through the jewel, because you're just starting out. You're not going to have all the jewels with resistance rolls on them. You're not going to have maybe the 5-socket Regalia. Use the Astromantis slot to get an amulet that actually has resists on it. That's going to be way more impactful as a beginner than getting an Astromantis. Don't get me wrong. Astromantis adds a lot of damage to the build, and obviously life and mana. It does add a lot, but early on in the build, it would be very expensive to buy Grand Spectrums. Those which also take up jewel slots, by the way, which impacts your effective overwhelming presence and blasphemy. So even if you could afford the Grand Spectrums, it's not as ideal as just not running the Astromantis. Having the improved aura is more important. Improved aura and just having res fixed and stats from a normal amulet and spirit, making sure you have enough spirit for everything, is way more budget friendly. So you get yourself a normal Alpha Howl, corrupted, no implicit, nothing, just a 100 spirit Alpha Howl, and you get yourself a spirit roll with some attributes, some resistances that you need on the amulet slot. And this is going to be much cheaper. So you're talking about 2 to 3 divs and you have yourself your helmet and your amulet. Unfortunately, because we are so strict on resists through the build, you do want to have at least a 4-socket Grand Regalia going into this build. And this is going to be the same for every single Gemling build. This is not a secret. It's something that you will want at least a 4-socket version of. And obviously, eventually, when you save up the money, a 5-socket. But you have to be able to budget. I believe at the time of making this video, they go for around 20 divs. So you're talking about, let's say, 3 divs between amulet, helmet, 20 divs for the Grand Regalia. Your Pillar of the Caged God, you can even get 2 of them for swapping. It makes it easier. You get a 3-socket Pillar of the Caged God, and then you run the attack speed core. Here it is. So you run 3 of these, and it gives you 15% attack speed. Versus getting 18%, which is much more expensive. So this is very min-max tier. Getting a Pillar of the Caged God with 8% increased attack speed is a corruption implicit. These go for around 8 to 10 divines a piece now for the 8% attack speed. And then you have the pillar that has the 12% weapon damage corruption. This is your bossing pillar. These go for around 1 to 2 divines a piece at the time of making this video. Unlike other builds, as I mentioned before, because of Blasphemy, we don't actually need to run pen on our Pillar of the Caged God for bossing. So you can either run attack speed or you can run critical damage. Those are 2 very fine options on your 12% pillar. But otherwise, again, for the purposes of a budget build, it's going to be hard for you to build into crit early. So I would just recommend having 2 pillars of 3-socket with the 5% attack speed cores. If you want to save yourself even more money, you can simply toggle between cast on shock and the 2 heralds, depending on what you're doing. But that's going to be, I'll leave that up to you to decide how you manage that. It's not super expensive to buy 3 cores plus the pillar. You're talking maybe 60 to 80 exalts total, unless the cores went up in price per pillar. Next is the Hand of Wisdom in action. It is extremely cheap to get a 3% attack speed with 1 to 10 lightning damage corrupted Hand of Wisdom in action these days. And I actually suggested at the beginning, don't search for a 1 to 11 or anything like that, unless you have more of a budget. But I actually very much recommend, because we are so tight on resists in this build, to get a 310 Hoa, which is the short term for saying 3% with 1 to 10, and have it with dual socket. This will allow you to build a lot more resistances by just slotting in more all-res cores, or slotting in, let's say, because as I mentioned, our Alpha Howl basically caps our cold res. You can put in, let's say, a lightning and a fire resist ruin in here. And the same goes with the trample toe. They are extremely cheap to just get a standard trample toe with two sockets in it. And then you again can do the same and put in two res. And the same can go with the Alpha Howl, because if you're starting out and on a budget, you get a 100 spirit, Alpha Howl, 2 socket, and you res fix again with the amulet with spirit on it. And that fixes your resists and everything else. There is the option of getting an attribute with spirit regalia, and those are much cheaper than getting the ones with all resists. That is going to be tougher, because now you're giving up resists, which is a suffix slot on most items, for spirit, which is a prefix slot on the amulet. So if you really want to go on even more of a budget, you can give up the 4-socket regalia with attribute res and take the spirit, and then you don't even need the spirit on the amulet after. But that is far more budget. Ingenuity, again, similar to Hand of Wisdom in action, these have gone down a lot in price. And you're talking about 4 divines for a 65% or better, which is honestly amazing. I highly recommend that you work for at least a 60%. I generally recommend 70%, but there is quite a big jump in price between the 60 and 70%. But at the minimum, save up for at least a 60%. You're going to be paying around 2 to 3 divines for that. So far in the build, we're at about 3 to 4 divines between the, let's say, 2-socket Alpha Howl, a budget amulet. We have our Grand Regalia that we have our Grand Regalia that's probably about 20 divines for a 4-socket corrupted. So now we're at 24 divines. We're paying one divine or so for the Hand of Wisdom in action. So we're at 25. Let's say 3 divines for the Ingenuity, so 28, and less than a divine for the Trample Toe and the pillars. So let's say total 2 pillars and a Trample Toe. You're saying maybe about 29 divines. Next are the rings. These are so incredibly important. Rings are the lifeblood of any Gemling. And it's what will really differentiate the endgame Gemlings from each other. Because Ingenuity is going to be used in just about every build, and Ingenuity is so strong for pushing the effect of the rings, one single ring is roughly the value of an Astramentus in Gemling builds. So you can see me taking it off, and my DPS tooltip goes from 923,000 over that to 489,000 off of a single ring. The rings are the lifeblood, and these are where there's just nearly infinite scaling, because there's always a better ring out there, unless you have a multi-mirror budget to go mirror a basically perfect ring and then get a Calandra's touch. Otherwise, there's so much scaling that can happen here that this is going to be something you get some entry-level rings, and there's no better time than the present. I mean, in the future, probably in a few days, it'll even be better. People are very much trying to craft themselves rings, so they're using essences for attributes, greater essences with attributes, and they're making some very good entry-level rings. There are some amazing rings on the market. I have a few that you get triple attribute rings these days for 1 to 2 divs. Rings like this would not have been even under 20 divines back in the day. And now you get them for dirt cheap. So you get triple attributes, you get decent rolls, all attributes, dex, int for under 10 divines. So you can set yourself up early if you're really on a budget. So we're talking already, we're about a 29 divine budget. You'll set yourself up at around maybe 5 divs per ring, and you will be really well set up. Remember, you do want at least the fire damage. I recommend getting fire and cold damage on the rings, and then afterwards the prefixes, you just want lightning damage is ideal. Cold damage is not bad either, because we do deal cold damage through the build, which is helps contribute to the freezing. But it is not a priority to get cold damage %. It's just if it happens to be on the ring that you buy, it's not the end of the world. So yes, rings will scale. For example, in the ring that I'm showing you, I've been offered over 150 divines for it. These are things that you can always get a better ring. Don't fret at the beginning. Get yourself budget rings. It's fine. You will still clear stuff. Flasks. Because we are running mind over matter, getting a melting maelstrom flask is decently important. Our mana pool is very large. Even when you're on a budget, you don't have the Astra, you don't have the good rings, your mana pool is still going to be very significant. Probably looking at about 2,500 to 3,500 early on. A normal mana flask is not going to be recovering remotely enough mana when you use it. You really do want to get a melting maelstrom as soon as possible. It is not a requirement to deal damage, but every time you are hit by a big hit and you lose 90% of your mana, you will very much feel how little impact a normal mana flask has. A melting maelstrom immediately recovers all mana when used. Does not matter how much mana you have, whether you have 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 mana, you are getting it all back immediately. So when if I, let's say off screen, something hits me for 5,000 damage, I can recover it all immediately. And because we're running Mind Over Matter, our mana regen is also naturally halved because of Mind Over Matter. So it takes a while to naturally regenerate that mana. And Tempest Flurry, so let's say you're on a boss and you lose all of it, that's where the mana on kill stuff doesn't really help as much anymore. And you can see it on other builds as well. Tempest Flurry is 46 cost, and we're attacking more than 15 times per second. That's not including the mana cost of Bell. So your 150 mana regen per second means absolutely nothing in the face of how much you're using for Tempest Flurry and Tempest Bell just to cast in 1 second. That is why Melting Maelstrom is really important. You don't ever want to be in that situation where you simply pop, where you get hit by some boss mechanic because you didn't freeze or stun in time, and now you're stuck. You're just trying to run around and survive while spamming all the mana potions that you have, all the charges that you have on your mana flask, and hoping that you can deal with whatever mechanics and dodge out of the mechanics and get back to killing the boss. Melting Maelstrom is a huge investment. Huge as in important. It is not a requirement up front. So I came from a very budget Gemling start where I did not have Melting Maelstrom, and they were over 35 divs back then. It was one of the last things that I added to my build after the Astromantis. But man, it really makes a difference. They are down to something like 4 divines at the time of this video, and they will keep getting cheaper because the endgame players are just farming megalomaniacs these days. So this is a really, it's much less expensive now. I will add the price of it, so we are talking about 33 divines so far as of today to make this build, including the Melting Maelstrom. And if you decide to skip it, it's no problem. You will be able to still clear stuff without it. Just note that it's higher risk to not have the Melting Maelstrom. It's also very nice when you're mapping. If ever you have a big stretch where you've already cleared all the monsters and you have to go back to go kill a rare that was tucked in a corner that you missed, that's where Melting Maelstrom is very nice, because you'll burn through your mana a lot as you're pathing back and forth through empty areas. It's not a problem whenever there's enemies. It's a problem when there are no enemies. So as I mentioned, it's not a problem because you hit one enemy, you get so much energy for Elemental Invocation, you proc it, you get like 15% of your mana back after every hit. Not a problem when there are enemies. Similar issue with Burning Ground. Not a problem when there are enemies because you're hitting so much off Elemental Invocation. It's a problem when there are no enemies and you're pathing around. So you're using Tempest Flurry, you're burning mana through Tempest Flurry, and then you're also pathing through Burning Ground, which is also going to take even more mana off because of Mind Over Matter. So Melting Maelstrom is a very important investment for the build. But so far, we're talking about 33 divines. And then, as I mentioned before, you need at least 2 perfect jewelers between Tempest Flurry and Tempest Bell. So you're talking 3 divs there. You're at a 36 divine budget so far. As you've noticed, I have basically no level 20s. They're all 19s and less, and then corrupted to +1, except for Overwhelming Presence, which is level 20 and then corrupted to +1. And do note that what you can do is you can take a lower level gem. So let's say I have my 17 because they're cheap, and then I take Overwhelming Presence, and I'm hoping I hit this on first try. It's not a big deal if I don't. It's just for the example. You quality it. So quality. If you want to, add your socket, doesn't really matter. And then you corrupt it. So we hit -1 on this one. But let's imagine that was +1. So now I would go equip that, and I would keep adding, and then you can actually add levels to it after the fact. This one's bricked, but anyway. The ailment threshold and stun threshold are offset from each other up until level 21. So I believe you get all the stun threshold, so you still get the 30% stun threshold. If you have a 19 plus 1, which is going to be significantly cheaper, it'll only cost you about 15 to 20 exalts for a 19 if you don't already have a whole stash full of them. Okay. So it'll cost you 15 to 20 exalts to get your level 19 plus 1 overwhelming presence. And so use lower level skill spirit gems that are very cheap, get your plus 1 corrupt, and then get the level 19 or 20 spirit gem. A level 20 spirit gem I believe is around 5 divines at the time of this video, so it does significantly add to the budget if you do it, but it is not an important part. Getting that extra 1% is not super important, especially when you're on the budget. Now let's talk about the jewels. First, you have an Against the Darkness. This slot, there's 2 main slots that you'll see Gemlings using Against the Darkness. This is a very original and standard slot, much cheaper to put it here. And there's another slot up here around the crit cluster spaghettification. We will not be using this. I'll talk about that later, but we will just be using a very standard Against the Darkness slot here. I recommend for the build, gain extra as cold and increased intelligence percent. The gain extra as cold makes it feel much better when it comes to freezing bosses versus getting something such as a gain extra as lightning. And we do also later in the tree get drenched, which also has another gain extra as cold. So between those two, you have a decent amount of cold damage. So again, as I mentioned, you don't really need flat cold on the rings. But if you get it, it's not the end of the world. And again, an Against the Darkness like this will cost you in the range of, sorry, not like this one, because this one has a 5% corrupt on intelligence. If you just want, let's say, a corrupted 3%, you're talking about 10 divs. You do not need this to start with. You do not need this to start with. And apparently I have a trade to do. But I do recommend that you do build into this later. So we get Sand in the Eyes. So these are attack speed nodes, and then we have Blind with attacks. We get some more attack speed from Sand in the Eyes, and then we have our very standard Jack of all trades, Polymathy. This is a very standard setup. Get these quick 2 jewel sockets, and then we path over. Falcon Dive. You take the top nodes when you're starting out and on a budget, because this is just attack damage percent. You take the bottom nodes when you're building into crit, and this is a very late game setup. Is when you build into crit. Early on, you do not worry about this. Just build your normal attack damage. Catalysis is really nice, but it will take you 1 extra. I'll talk about this later. Catalysis is really nice. So first is on the budget, you will not have a Megalomaniac, or at least you should not have a Megalomaniac. Building into the Megalomaniac is a very late game portion. On a budget, you will be pathing very similarly. You will come all the way around the top, get Mind Over Matter, and then path down here into Bolstering Presence. So you will get this 44% set from Bolstering Presence. So when you're doing your calculation on what percent you need, so remember you need 3.3 multi, which means you need 3.3 minus 1 because that's increased. So this is how much increased effect you need, which is multiplied by 100, so 230. You get 44 from the Bolstering Presence nodes. You get 44 from these. So 24 plus 20, you get 44. This means that you need to reach 186 increased effect of auras. Now, it will probably be quickly obvious to you that you do not have enough jewel sockets to do that unless you have Adorned. And again, this is where the main scaling comes in for this build, is that you want to just push as much aura effect as possible. It is not a requirement to hit that 186 mark, but the closer you are to it, the more you'll feel the effect of the crowd control and how much elemental invocation is proccing. So every jewel socket that you do end up getting should have an increased effect of auras. Do not pass that 186, but generally it is not possible to pass this unless you have an adorned. And I did put in the link the different breakpoints for the different adorned sets. So I would say 60% is the minimum that you would want to buy, which will cost you a decent chunk. I did not check before starting the video how much those adorns cost. So off the top of my head, I believe a 60% is probably in the range of 50 to 100 divines. I'm not going to include that as part of the budget variant. I do not believe that you need an adorn to do it, and there are multiple viewers on the Twitch and in the Discord that are doing the build without adorn, and it is working very well, even without that little push. But again, this is to be very clear that eventually you do want an adorned. So your version 2, so if you're following the version 2 link, you will path all the way to bolstering presence. Get that 44% increased effect. And then you need 186, and you generally have around 11 jewel sockets to work with. So you can do the math. I did show the math in the link. So follow that. Generally, you will not have this section. This is my megalomaniac segment. So again, the points that we are going to be using for bolstering have been moved over basically to here and to some crit. So early on, you will not be building this crit node, this crit tree. You will be pathing with these points to bolstering presence and probably another jewel socket. Falcon technique, Falcon dive are very obvious. These are just attack speed boosts. Dex gives you some accuracy rating, as well as some accuracy boosts through the tree. Will give you some attack speed here. So that's attack speed through Falcon dive. Again, you also get the crit chance on the bottom side or the attack damage on the top side. Falcon technique is a lot of attack speed per dex. So 1 attack speed per 15 dex when we're running 600 plus dexterity is very nice. One quick note, because of Jack of all trades, try and keep your lowest attributes more or less in line. I like to keep 600, 600, and 1000 for my attributes. Obviously, this is with an Astromentis. This is with a very stacked ingenuity plus stacked rings. Generally, you can expect to hit around 500, 500, and 800. When you're on more of a budget and you don't have the Astra, probably around 400, 400, 600, something like that without the Astra. So that's roughly the numbers that you could expect to get. This is a very quick 3 points along the tree to get 25 dexterity, crit damage bonus, accuracy rating, which again, remember, scales Falcon dive, along with just some more straight up attack speed. Here we get quick jewel sockets and we keep going. Remember, invocated efficiency, this is where we get our mana from. So we get this node. This is important. Path over here, we get the controlled metamorphosis. This is such a strong slot for the controlled metamorphosis because it allows you to get pure power, which saves you 5 points for pathing to pure power. And this is 2% lightning damage per 10 in. And that's one of the main reasons we don't build lightning damage anywhere else, really, is because this is already so much lightning damage. And even when you're looking at megalomaniacs, I'll talk about that later, you do not really care too much about lightning damage because you're getting so much from it here. We do take lightning quick, which does have lightning damage, but also it's just 1 point for a quick 14% lightning damage and 8% attack speed with lightning skills, which Tempest Flurry is a lightning skill. Then we get Drenched, chance to shock, and gain extra lightning as cold damage. Gain 5% of lightning damage as extra cold damage. So remember, we are dealing primarily lightning, so this is basically a small multiplier on top. And this is also what is helping you freeze. So between drenched and the against the darkness with the cold, you are more than capable of freezing absolutely everything. You don't even need ice bite proc, you don't need any of the heralds proc. You will freeze stuff between those two. Against the darkness, controlled metamorphoses can get very expensive. This is a perfect non-corrupted roll, and this would run you around 70 divines right now. It is not required. For getting even a -7 and -5 roll, you are already down to 20 divines. So resists, it is a balancing act of how much you have to spend on each piece, and your resistances. Your resistances overall with the build will suffer, but remember I mentioned Astra Mentis is going to be one of the last pieces that you will ever get for this build. That and the Megalomaniacs. So use this amulet slot to really help with the resistances early on. So here we have our metamorphosis. We get our 3 spots. Again, if you're using Spark or something else, there's some other really nice nodes as well. So it's not a bad thing to invest into a metamorphosis, especially if you do have multiple characters. I do get Whispers of Doom. The Whispers of Doom is so that I can apply Hand of Chayula and apply Hypothermia on the enemies for minus cold resistances. So this again is helping with freezing, and it is just a little bit of an extra damage boost and optimization, considering we do have 2 gain extra as colds in the build. This is very minimal. If you want to completely drop Hypothermia and drop Whispers of Doom, no problem. Then you can just use Hand of Chayula with Voltaic Mark. Or even just apply Voltaic Mark directly on the boss as it spawns. So that I'll leave up to you. Now the jewels. So as I mentioned earlier, the rare jewels, you're looking at about 20 to 100 exalts a piece. You want to maybe get yourself a mana on kill to start. It'll probably feel quite nice to get a 2% mana on kill. Increased effective aura. You want to push 10%. You really do want to push 10%, especially if you're going for rare jewels, because you will only have around 11 jewel sockets to work with. So do keep that in mind, that when you are searching, try and at least focus on the 10% aura, and then any extra damage you get on top, mana on kill, mana regeneration rate, things like that, are just bonuses on top. But keep within your budget. You do have to fill around 11 slots. So before getting into the passive tree, our budget was in the range of 33 divs, including the Maelstrom, the Flask. And then you're looking at, depending on the role for the metamorphosis, I do recommend that it is part of the things that you should look for. You're looking at around, at minimum, 10 divines for a workable metamorphosis. I'm talking about not min roll, anything like that. So 43 divines so far. The Against the Darkness is very much, you can go all the way to 1 divine for a gain extra as cold with like some other useless roll. You can go to 1 or 2 divines for something like that, all the way up to 200 divines or more if you want a 5/5. So 5% is cold and 5% is lightning. Sorry, 5% is cold and 5% is int. It is very, I would say, minimal, the effect of this. It is a strong jewel. I would say don't focus too hard on getting a perfect roll or something. At the time of this video, a 4/4 uncorrupted is running about 25 divines, and corrupted 4/2s, I would know, is, because I have one for sale, is 13 divines or less. So just a few percentage points will make a huge difference on the price, and it just goes down. If you're willing to take a 2/2 to start, or even, as I mentioned, don't even take the 2 stats together, just either get an intelligence one with another crappy roll, or the cold damage only one with another crappy roll. That's okay as well. The 5% int, it does it, you can tell it makes a big impact. But but again, that's off of a very high base of int. So what you can afford is part of the budget. If you cannot, don't forget, if you don't have the Ascendency, your rings are not as strong. You do not have as much int to multiply off of anyway. So I would say, again, focus on just, if you're on a budget, get a 2-2, a 2-3, something like that. They're going to be much cheaper. I'm gonna say that your budget for the Against the Darkness on a budget build should be about 3 divines, 3 to 5 divines. So let's say our build is up to 30, 36, 37 divines right now. Your jewels, you have 11 jewels to fill. At the minimum, I would expect to pay 100 exalts a piece. So 1100 exalts for 11 just rare jewels with 10% increased effective auras with something other decent on it as well. I've searched, I've seen them cheaper with other good rolls on it as well. But let's say 1100 is a very fair amount. That's about 3 divines. We're talking about a 40 divine budget right now. With the Metamorphosis, that's another 10 divine budget. And so total between every single gear piece with a 60 to 65% ingenuity, just a 2-socket Hand of Wisdom in action, 2-socket Trample Toe, 2-socket Alpha Howl, a budget amulet, a 4-socket Regalia, just 2 budget pillars, and the Metamorphosis, you're looking at around a 50. You can fit this in for a 50 divine budget, I would say. Now here's the kicker, and this is how every single let's say MMO, especially ARPG, is going to go: the min-maxing. And that's where it gets much more expensive. Obviously, eventually, you want to build into your Astromantis, you want to build into other things. What is the priority to upgrade once you've finished at least the budget build? If you've been following along, you know that Aura Effect for Overwhelming Presence is very strong. So you want to be getting an Adorned and swapping into increased effective aura corrupted magic jewels. And that is going to be your first step after doing this whole budget shenanigans. So you have, like, as long as you have 2 decent rings, the Adorned and boosting up the aura effect will be the biggest change in the feeling of the build. The problem is that, again, you're 60, even starting with a 60% Adorned, you're looking at a probably around 50 to 100 divines. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. I didn't search for that today. But you're looking at around, at a minimum, 50 divines. So that's already doubling the budget of the build for just to add in the Adorn. And these scale up. The 91% that you have here is running probably around 270 divines right now. So again, it scales, and it's always how it is. Regardless of what build, whose build you look at, as soon as you talk about Adorn in a build, it just scales nearly infinitely until you hit the mirror tier. And even then, a 100% Adorn is running almost 2 mirrors right now. So you have to stick within the budget. We're talking about 60%. Adorn is your second step in the build. So you started with your budget. Now you hit your second step, is you finally got your Adorned. It's 60%, and you have to start hunting these jewels with increased effective auras. You're looking for corrupted ones between 1 and 5 divines, depending on what the other role is. They are so dependent on what that second role is. And don't be afraid to buy some cheap ones. If you see uncorrupted ones pop up for cheap, buy them, corrupt them yourself. I've seen them pop up for 100 exalts, 150 exalts, and you can really save yourself a lot of currency by doing that. So for example, this one I corrupted myself with lightning resistance. And most of the ones I have in the tree are actually I corrupted myself. This one I did over the weekend. Anyway. The end game is to get the ones with critical hit chance or critical hit damage, but one step at a time. start with getting the 10% increased effective auras, and then try and also target the ones with resistances or attributes on top. The second line is matters less, but it is also nice to get a mana on kill or mana regeneration rate, crit chance, or crit damage when you do have the opportunity. Otherwise, do not worry about it too much on the second stage of the Stunling. So you just want to fill every slot with a 10% aura effect and the Adorned. Check the calculations that I have in the build for the Adorned. Depending on what role you have, I write out what jewels that you need and what amounts, because again, you cannot pass that 230% increased effective auras, otherwise overwhelming presence will no longer work. So check the calculations, figure out the jewels that you need to purchase and what percentages on the increased effective auras, and hit as close to that 230% increased effective auras, plus that includes the bolstering presence effects. So now you have step 2. You've gotten the jewels, you got your basic Adorned. Next step, one of the biggest upgrades that you can do is change your Hand of Wisdom and action to a 1 to 12. Now, you see here I have a 4 to 12. Before I got this one, I had a 3 to 12. Sorry, a 3% with 1 to 12. I put the 4-12 on. I'm telling you that it was maybe a 5% difference. You can get an amazing 50 plus attribute 312 Hoa for 35, 40 divines. A 4 to 12 with at least 40 attributes, like you see here, is running 170 divines for roughly 5% increase in DPS tooltip. So again, 3 to 12, much cheaper, much more affordable, still an incredible damage increase. You are looking at about 20-25% increase in damage, especially if you get more attributes over the standard one that you had before. But remember, you're losing a socket versus the 2 socket that I recommended before. You're losing a socket, that means more difficult on resists. Same with the Alpha Howl. You do eventually want to switch into one with Spirit so that you are now prepped when you do get that Astramentus. You are then prepped for that changeover. You are looking for 70+% on the cold res with at least 25 spirits. So remember, I mentioned if you qual that Blasphemy to 22 or better, you need one less. But otherwise, get the 26, because then you can also get the +1 corrupt on the Blasphemy instead. And get more increased effect of your curse. So, your Alpha Howl with this roll is probably looking around 30 to 40 divines with the 26 spirit and 70 plus cold res. Your Hand of Wisdom action, depending on what attributes you get, you're looking at around 30 to 40 divines. So these are the part of the version 2 Stunling, the past the budget, what you're prioritizing after the budget. So again, you're Adorned, getting your blue magic jewels, and also getting the 312 Hoa. After that, the next big change is the Regalia, and I say big because it's actually not a huge change, but it will feel very different. Getting the 5 socket Regalia is a small boost to your attributes, 5%, small, but it's the resistances. Getting that extra socket means not only do you get an extra 10% all elemental resist, you get another socket to put another resist in. So let's say you, instead of like chaos res like I have here, you decide to go full all res on your Regalia. You go from a 60% all res to a 75% all res. That's a pretty significant change. That's a 25% boost. Simply what it is. 25% boost. In that all res. So that 5 socket does feel decently impactful. So there's that to look forward to. And then again, if you have the budget, improve your rings. Now, scaling into the min-max endgame territory, which is where I'm at now. You're going to start with an 80% adorned, and then you are going to unspec bolstering presence, all of this here. And then you're going to grab yourself a megalomaniac with bolstering presence on it. I was lucky. I found this one for sale with spaghettification, which opens up the anoint slot on my Ascendency. I've collected a few different megalomaniacs that I will be offering up on the Discord at market prices or below market prices, so that I picked up and tested with. So, for example, I have one with perfect opportunity on it already. So you get yourself a megalomaniac with bolstering presence, and then this avoids you having to allocate all the way over here. So instead of needing 186 now, you need 230 minus 20 because that's bolstering. You need your jewels to add up to 210 or as close as possible. Again, in my version 3 of the Stunling build, the link to that, I have the calculations for each of the adorns starting at 80%, 80, 85, 90, and what to look for. So now once you get that 80% adorned, your jewels are going to be boosted more. And so that's why this is no longer budget. This is definitely not budget where I'm at now. Is you are pushing to still hit that high 200 to 230% increased effective auras while being able to get a megalo, and that allows you to get at least one extra notable in the build. And then so I have a whole trade filter of what notables are useful with the build. Obviously here I have spaghetti and bolstering, but I have other ones here like heartbreaking and honed instincts. So this gives you crit damage bonus, strength. This one has attack speed and dexterity. I have honorless, which is 50% increased melee damage against immobilize, which is stunned and freeze, which we both do. You have coming calamity, increased lightning and cold damage while affected by herald device and herald of thunder, so it's not as good. But again, while you're mapping and you have the heralds up, it's not exactly a bad idea to pop this one in, and it still has the bolstering in case you don't have anything else to use in the meantime. So this is where the end game scaling really hits and can get really expensive, or you might get lucky. Bolstering is not a very popular megalomaniac at this time, so most of them are quite cheap to get and still have a nice damage notable passive on it. So why perfect opportunity? Why did I anoint this? Damage with hits is lucky against heavy stunned enemies. So if you can get perfect opportunity in the build, this is roughly a 33% boost in damage. Because your end game is to build into crit, Lightning Rod is no longer going to be useful to you because it's only working on non-crit. And where I'm at right now, I have roughly around 65 to 70% crit rate once I apply critical weakness to the enemy using Eye of Winter. So Lightning Rod becomes no longer useful. It's very nice early in that budget version, but in the budget version, you don't have extra points to get it anyway, unfortunately. But when you're in that in between where you can get the Megalo but haven't actually built the crit jewels yet, Lightning Rod is great. But then you will very quickly end up in a place where Lightning Rod is no longer as useful as you start building up more and more and more crit. Perfect Opportunity is the only other time that we can get Lucky Strikes in our build. So if you don't know what Lucky Strikes are, is it rolls your damage roll twice, and lightning damage rolls are very wide. So for example, you have, let's say, a 1 to 100 roll. If you look at some of the weapons with lightning damage, I saw earlier a 1 to 226 roll on lightning. So lightning damage is a very wide rolling damage type. And so that's why Lightning Rod exists, because it allows you to roll twice. So let's say you have a 1 to 100 roll on lightning. Your expected is 100 plus 1 divided by 2. So your expected is around 50.5 for damage. Now you might hit a 2, it's possible. And so the lucky strikes means it rerolls your damages. It rerolls your damages. So you get to roll your damages twice, meaning that that 1 to 100 range, let's say you hit a 2 on the first roll, well, now the lucky strike might actually hit a 98 on the second roll, and now your damage is 98. So effectively, when you have lucky strikes in a build like this, where you have a very wide range, it becomes roughly a 33% increase in damage, having the lucky strikes. The tighter the range, the less the lucky strikes matter. But in a build like this, you're in that range. You're in that range. So we get lucky strikes through perfect opportunity, which also improves stun buildup as well. Not that it's terribly important, but I would say perfect opportunity is one of the optimal things that you can route into the build, on top of also Falcon Technique, because then you can reroute how you do your jewels. So if you get Falcon Technique plus, let's say, Spaghetti, or plus perfect opportunity on a Megalo, then you would now route in through the top here and get these attributes, and then you can get the jewel socket here. You skip this whole portion, and then you can route in from, let's say, the top here and hit this and hit this and skip the Falcon Technique because it's on your Megalo. So there are those options as well for your endgame scaling. But I've been searching forever. I've not found a good 3-line Megalo for myself. I've only found good 2-line Megalos, like the one that I have here. So the Bringer of Order is a completely useless node for this build. Anyway, your endgame scaling, your jewels are going to look very similar to this. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. Critical hit chance with int and increased effective auras, or you have a critical hit chance plus res roll. And because of the Alpha Howl, because of the Regalia, you do not need cold res, but you do want to stack lightning res, fire res, and chaos res to a degree. I find chaos res is not that impactful in this game. There's not too many situations where you need the chaos resistance. I would say the cultist archers are the main source of chaos damage, and that's going to be up to you how much you care about the chaos res versus other. But I do have a good amount of both, of chaos res. I had to change something and I'm missing lightning res, but we will get there. I will keep searching for jewels, keep corrupting jewels, and we will get there. But that is the end game. Is now, what do you do once you have the Adorned, once you have your Atramentus and everything? You search for the Megalos, you search for the jewels, and you just try slowly and over time building up and getting slightly better rings, better jewels, and better Megalos. And ingenuity too. So I would say that the Atramentus is one of the lowest priority items in the build. You will be much better off early actually getting the Spirit and being able to keep budget off of the Alpha Howl and put it into other places. And obviously, Atramentus is 300 divs right now, or more actually. I checked only a few days ago, and it was 300 divines for an Uncorrupted. And Uncorrupted is very nice, because if you get a Megalo that has Spaghetti like mine, or if you get a Megalo that has something else that's useful, then you can change the anoint. And my Megalo with Spaghetti allows me to anoint whatever I want and get to test multiple different notables as anoints. So, Uncorrupted Atramentus is probably around 300 to 350 now. So that's where the build is at. We've talked about the skill gems. We've talked about the rotations. Your bossing is you just Hand of Chayula at the boss as soon as they finish spawning in. And then you hold Tempest Flurry, and you press Tempest Bell, and you're done. Every boss is going to die. Generally always be frozen, stunned, shocked, ignited, and they'll die by the time any of that expires. So hopefully you found this build guide useful. I'm almost always accessible on the Discord. I stream regularly, usually during the weekdays. My weekends tend to be busy. So if you have any questions about the build, let me know either down in the comments or come over to the Discord or Twitch channel, and I'll be happy to answer questions about the build. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy it, and hope to see another Stunling around. Ciao.